Hello, and thank you for joining today's program, Comparing Drone Regulatory Regimes Around the Globe, hosted by Dentons, the Small UAV Coalition, and Drone Alliance Europe. We have a wonderful program in store for you today. Please note that attendee lines have been muted for this program. Should you have any questions that you would like to submit during the event, you may submit them through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Additionally, today's webinar will be recorded and circulated to all participants after the event. With that, I would now like to turn things over to today's moderator and Denton's partner, Catherine McCulloch. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Maddie. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you. Thank you for being here. As Maddie said, I'm Catherine McCulloch. I'm pleased to be your moderator. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the Small UAV Coalition, the Drone Alliance Europe, and Dentons. And a bit about each before we start things off. The Small UAV Coalition is a leading drone organization that advocates before the US Congress and the executive branch for a risk-based regulatory framework that will allow the safe and expedited integration of drones into the national airspace. The coalition actively advocates for a mature regulatory framework that will allow operations, including highly automated operations at scale and beyond visual line of sight. Wing and Zipline, represented today by two of the panelists, are members of the coalition. The Drone Alliance Europe is a leading drone organization in Europe that works with the European Commission, EASA, and European civil aviation authorities to develop a risk-based regulatory framework to progress the potential of the drone industry and its numerous benefits to people and the environment. Wing is also a member of DAE, and another panelist, Lorenzo Mercily, serves as a strategic advisor to DAE. Dentons, the world's largest law firm by number of attorneys, has a global drone practice. My drone practice is in Canada, and Garrettgerstner, another panelist, practices in Asia. Given the increasingly global nature of operations of many companies in this industry, our global group of practitioners who specialize in this area has prepared a comparative guide to global drone regulations. It spotlights different jurisdictions and industries where the use of drones are poised to exponentially increase. The comparative guide is a tool for any business operating across jurisdictions, and we'll circulate a link for the free download of that after this webinar. So without any further ado, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists who are more than qualified to be speaking with us today. And I'll start with Margaret Nagel. Margaret is the head of policy, regulatory, and community affairs at Wing, where she leverages extensive private sector and government experience to pioneer new aviation use cases and improve opportunities for communities around the world. Prior to her time at Wing, Margaret was the head of America's government affairs at X, the Moonshot Factory, and Yahoo, where she set public policy priorities, and worked to advance and protect their business interests with governments. Margaret also served as the assistant to the Vice President for Legislative Affairs, where she was the Vice President's top liaison to Congress, and as the Director of Legislative Affairs at the Office of Management and Budget, where she led the administration's legislative efforts on budget and appropriation bills. Welcome, Margaret. Garrettgerstner. Kurt, a US lawyer working in Denton's office in Seoul, South Korea, brings decades of aviation experience to our firm. He has advised and represented many of the major commercial airlines, global manufacturers of airframes, aircraft engines, and other components, aviation service and training companies, as well as, and most importantly for our discussion today, companies engaged in the development of unmanned aircraft systems. Much of his practice focuses on helping companies identify and manage risks in the development of new products and in their operations, protecting them from future liability and expense, and giving them an advantage over their competitors. Welcome, Kurt. Lorenzo Mercily. Lorenzo is the founder and CEO of Mercily Consulting, a digital consulting agency focused on aviation, and the co-founder of Drone Talks Online, a digital platform to spread ideas and educate on the drones ecosystem. Leader of the Joint Authorities for Rulemaking on Unmanned Systems, or JARUS, WG6, He oversees the work of more than 100 professionals in several task forces developing recommendations for safety and risk management of drone operations around the world. A guest lecturer at various universities and previously with Leonardo Pilatus Aircraft and the Swiss Federal Office of Civil Aviation, Lorenzo has developed a striking ability to boost innovation in safety critical environments and enjoys exploring the intersection of safety and disruptive technologies that can advance the human race forward. He's also a trained engineer. Welcome, Lorenzo. And last but certainly not least, Harrison Wolf. It's very early in the morning for Harrison. He is the Director of Global Aviation Policy at Zipline, based in the US. Zipline is the world's leading on-demand delivery service, revolutionizing the medical supply chain and creating the world's first logistics system built to serve everyone. Harrison is a leader in the field of international unmanned aircraft system safety and risk mitigation strategies, regulatory development, government support, and industry ecosystems. In this field, he's authored books, chaired sessions at the World Economic Forum, and is an instructor at the University of Southern California. Welcome, Harrison. So you've heard a lot from me already. So without anything further, we'll start things off. And my first question or first topic is really about the comparison of political institutions and how that's really impacting the evolution of drone regulation and the speed at which they're evolving. So I'll start off by directing this to you, Lorenzo, and Harrison, I'll ask you to jump in after that. But of course, any panelists, please feel free to join if you have thoughts. So Lorenzo, start us off with a discussion about the structure of political institutions in your jurisdiction and how that impacts on drone regulations.
Sure, and welcome everyone also from my side. So as most of you know, I'm based in Switzerland and if you want in Europe, and the structure here, as you can imagine, is not necessarily simple. I'll try to really simplify it as much as possible and discuss about three different layers of institutions that impact drone regulation here in Europe. So the highest layer is the European Commission, obviously, right? The European Commission is the legislative branch, and they adopt regulation based on EASA opinions. EASA being the European Aviation Safety Agency, and that being kind of the same second layer, or if the main layer of what's happening here in Europe. So EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, they issue opinions to the Commission for adopting certain regulation. For example, recently the drone regulation, the U-Space regulation, they are all generated within EASA and then sent to the Commission for adoption. They also issue what is called non-binding documents, so all the soft law, as we used to call it in the aviation world, like certification specifications, means of compliance, guidance, for operators, manufacturers to comply with the requirements. The third layer here in Europe are all the member states. And obviously the member states are tasked to enforce and implement whatever regulation which is coming from EASA when this regulation is available, and therefore achieving harmonization. Plus, they are still responsible for a series of organizational and operational requirements, like issues of licenses, air operator certificates, training, production, individual airworthiness certificates, aerodrome certificates, and so on. What is interesting here about in Europe about drones is that historically drones have always been and still are to some extent under the jurisdiction of the member states, and this led in the past to a very disharmonized set of rules that were very difficult to follow. And only recently, in the greater scheme of things, so in a couple of years, EASA published the drone regulation that will entered into force, and it is slowly becoming applicable in all the member states. And this is now leading to a significant amount of harmonization across the European member states. The member states are still responsible for issuing the approvals, etc., but they will do so in an harmonized fashion. One last thing that I think which could be interesting to everybody is that in Europe, the state of design of any aircraft is EASA. So even if member states issue approvals for individual operation, etc., if manufacturers want to certify or recently different term design verify their drones, they will anyway be dealing with the EASA, and this verification or certification are recognized in all member states. So this is kind of the three levels that we have here in Europe. Obviously, there is a possibility to reallocate responsibilities between these three levels if so needed or required, but the structure is pretty much what I described.
Lorenzo, the structure dictates so much of how the regulations unfold for operators, and it seems to me that it's ripe for that harmony that you talked about, that you're slowly seeing, but then also for conflict. Have there been any examples of conflict in either the recommendations, so the soft recommendations, or laws between the different levels?
I think this is interesting, and those on the call, I know that some of them were part of the task forces in charge of creating the actual regulation. You could see all this conflict emerging in those meetings, like in the very challenging role that the EASA has had and still have to somehow reconcile all these different positions. Like, as you know, Europe is made of member states that have very different culture and perspective of the world. You have states that are somehow very liberal and tend to allow operations, for example, in the context of drones, right? Allow operation and only prohibit what is proved to be dangerous, right? Others that do not have same incentives and tend to prohibit everything unless proven extremely safe, right? And when attempting to put these people together in the same room and create a common harmonized regulation, that's a big challenge. So, I mean, I was sitting in these rooms. I remember the conversation. I was coming from one of progressive states, and fighting my way through at the time as Swiss FOCA, somehow against those that were a little bit less progressive. And I mean, I always remember the nowadays legendary Yves Maurier, the rulemaking officer in charge at the EASA, having this challenge of mitigating all of these different positions. And conflicts can arise at all levels, like from, do we need an altitude limits for drones? What can we allow under visual line of sight? Or what is the type of training that you want for pilot? Do we need the in-person training, or online is sufficient? So it's really not necessarily the highest level that is conflictual, but really down also in the details, which is also one of the reasons why sometimes in Europe it takes quite some time, right, to get this regulation going. Because you want to be careful of making sure that everybody somehow at the end is unhappy with the result, and that therefore everybody means you reached a good compromise, right? So that's one of the roles that the EASA has.
And Margaret, before I turn to Harrison, did you want to jump in on that? You're on mute. You're on mute, just so you know.
Yeah, one thing that I would jump in just based on what Lorenzo said really quickly is, one of the things as someone in the industry who is working through this process, one of the things that we find works really well to address where there are those differences is having those regulations be performance or outcomes based versus very specific in the way that they're implemented. And so that's one of the things that you'll see industry oftentimes advocating, because we may have a slightly different way to approach something. And if regulators and policymakers are able to create rules that are outcomes and performance based, a lot of times you can navigate some of those different approaches that different either countries or regulators, or even frankly the industry, may have.
That's great. And then I guess that makes the challenge even greater for the regulator trying to understand if you've complied, but we'll get to that. Thanks, Margaret. Harrison, over to you about, I guess, if you would like to talk about the structure in the US and how that impacts what we've seen in regulation.
Sure. No, thank you very much, Catherine. And I couldn't agree more with Margaret and Lorenzo's perspectives. I think it's always a pleasure to hear what the Swiss are doing. I had the pleasure to work with Lorenzo for a number of years while I was at the World Economic Forum, looking at what makes certain countries so different, right, in their approaches. And the one thing that stuck with me that Lorenzo told me was, just because they didn't know how to do something wasn't a reason not to do something. Like they were asked to figure it out. And this, I think, has been a real catalyst for the industry, whether that's through the manifestation of the SORA process or JARIS or moving throughout the world for risk-based. Anyway, so just getting back to your question from the US, I think we have a huge opportunity in the United States. We're lucky to work with such a large geographic area with one jurisdiction, right? Working directly with the FAA. When a decision gets made, it matters for the entire country, right? And I think that that's something that we benefit from dramatically. There's a lot less concern around harmonization. There's no concern around, trying to figure out what the rules will be in one area versus another. And I think that as soon as we lose some of that, I think there's some tension in the industry or beyond the industry around what can be a local matter, what can be a state matter, and what can be handled at the national level. The more we lose that, the more difficult it'll be for industry to be successful. I think one of the things that strikes me as a difference in the United States versus some of our international jurisdictions where we operate, whether that's Ghana or Rwanda at national scale, is that as Lorenzo pointed out, the incentives are different, right, for different countries, and so I think the risk appetite is also very different. And so, what may be a little bit easier to understand and, saving a number of lives or impacting dramatically a mother mothers who would be bleeding out during childbirth in Rwanda or in Ghana is a lot less easy to understand when you're in, a more, in the United States, for example, even though we have some of those same health issues and healthcare disparities in rural populations. So I think the more that we're able to engage with our both political counterparts, but also regulatory counterparts, and sort of tell that message of why this matters, why a risk-based approach is the right one to get flying, the more success we've had. And it's been fantastic to work with our FAA partners over the last year and just seeing how rapid that growth is and what the appetite is to try to make some of this happen. I'm really excited, for example, about the FAA, the BVLOS Aviation Rulemaking Committee. I think that's going to be an immense catalyst for the industry. And thank you to all those both in the participation and then in the attendees today and on this panel who are members of that, because it's a lot of time, it's a lot of energy, but it's really advancing the ball forward for us here.
Well, that's a hopeful remark to move forward to our next question on. Thank you, Harrison. So Kurt, I'll turn to you with the next topic. That's I guess,
actually, can I just make a comment on this first topic?
By all means.
I'm focused on Asia, and although you're dealing with individual countries in Asia, one important characteristic of Asia is that even though you have a single country, you may be dealing with multiple regulators, multiple people making decisions. So although in a place like Singapore, you have a single entity, the Civil Aviation Authority, they're making the decisions. But take Korea, for example, there are 4 different government institutions that have direct regulatory oversight of UAVs. Some of them are on a national basis, and then there's also regional offices of aviation in Korea that have their own oversight of activities that take place within their provinces, within their territory. China is another example. You have Civil Aviation Administration in China, which provides guidelines that cover the whole country, but there are some issues about whether all those guidelines are enforceable nationally. And then you have all these local and regional areas, governments that have oversight over their own areas too. So there's these opportunities because of the patchwork of regulations that could be even conflicting that might create difficulties. So you really have to know where you're operating and see who the regulators are and who the decision makers are and see if there are any conflicts.
That's fascinating and sounds like a real maze to navigate. Would you describe the structure, I guess starting with Korea and then any others, as more restrictive or more permissive? How would you categorize it?
Well, I think across Asia, there has been an evolution. So, the regulatory framework has been evolving from little or no regulations to what I think is quite restrictive in general. I'll give you an example. For Korea, there was a single aviation act that was the only law related to aviation for decades. And then in 2012, the government and regulators noticed that there's a lot more use of UAVs, and they said, hey, we better do something about that. So they made some amendments to that law and started to regulate some UAVs, but they were just the largest size ones. There was no regulation relating to smaller UAVs. Over time, that has changed. More and more laws have been enacted that will deal with those. And in general, the laws in Korea, and I think it's true in other parts of Asia, they limit certain types of activities. They now relate, in Korea, all UAVs are regulated now, whether they be non-commercial or commercial. There are different requirements depending on the purpose, the use, whether it's commercial or not commercial, the size of the UAVs, what they're going to be engaged in. There are limits on locations where they can be used. Interesting thing about Korea is that it's still technically at war, North Korea and South Korea. So you have a vast number of military installations located around the country of South Korea that are off limits. So there are regulations relating to where you can fly, whether you can fly in those areas. Aerial photography is a big issue for the government. So those have to be dealt with as well. Whether they're training requirements, licensing requirements, registration requirements, those are all covered by the regulations that exist now. In other parts of Asia, we see pretty much the same thing. Singapore has a lot of similar types of laws. Japan, as an example, they got a little bit late to the game. They started regulating UAVs around 2015, I believe. And a lot of their regulations, they have limitations, but one can get approvals to exempt themselves out of the limitations. So that's a little bit different. As I mentioned, China has kind of a mix of national guidelines and also local regulations, but they all seem to generally follow the same approach of limits on where you can use the UAVs, how you can use them, altitude limits, whether there's licensing requirements, registration requirements, and that continues to change. New regulations seem to keep coming up on a yearly basis.
And the nature of go ahead, Harrison.
Yeah, just very quickly, I think it's interesting one thing you said about Japan, which is that they got into the game sort of late, which on the one hand, you could say, yes, they did, because their initial regulatory act around drones came much later. But they've been flying Yamaha RMAXs for 10 years before that, right? So for agricultural purposes. So to say that perhaps maybe they got into the game late is really just they sort of aligned their regulatory process with other approaches later. And they've had a ton of success sort of roboticizing their farming industry under the Bureau of Land Management and Agriculture. So it's really interesting to see that dynamic play out where, on the one hand, yes, a little bit later, but on the other hand, if we're measuring success through the use of drones and through the implementation and the safe use of drones, I would say they were way ahead of the rest of the world.
Harrison, you also raised something that I should mention, and that is there are direct regulations of drones that exist in a lot of these countries, but there are also indirect regulations that are not part of the drone regulatory structure or regime. So, for example, privacy laws. Those exist in just about all of these countries, or probably in every country, and those have great application to the use of drones, but they're not in the laws. So if one did not know to look there, you potentially could miss those. And in Asia in particular, a lot of countries criminalize activities that might be civil liability in other countries. So in the enforcement rules, for example, in Korea, there are a lot of enforcement rules that provide criminal penalties, both fines and even imprisonment for violation of or failure to comply or follow certain regulations. For instance, in agriculture, if you don't have a permit to disperse pesticides, that could be a criminal violation subject to imprisonment. Not having a registration could subject you to imprisonment. So there's a lot of issues you have to really know about and be aware of, even if they're not in the drone laws themselves.
And Kurt, going back to something you said earlier, it seems as though a lot of the regulations are based on use rather than necessarily tied to risk. Is that accurate? And perhaps discuss that for us.
Yeah, I think most of the written regulations are tied to use rather than risk, but there are certainly regulations that will relate to risks. I mean, for instance, in no-fly areas, use of drones near airports, use of drones where you're taking photographs over sensitive military or government institutions. In Beijing, for example, there's very little ability to use drones because the whole city is full of government offices, so that can be a problem. So they do look at that restrictions related to the use of pesticides, as another example.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Kurt. So we'll switch gears and I'll move on to Margaret. And this next topic will really cover comparisons. And I know that your organization's operating in multiple. So give us your views on how you think different countries are doing in terms of facilitating the growth of the industry, and what you think is needed to keep moving the ball forward.
Sure, thanks. I want to pick up on something to start this off with that Harrison and Lorenzo talked about a little bit while back, and that's the bias for action, right? And for getting to yes. And I think one of the things that we've seen in operating and looking at how we would operate and where we want to operate is that a desire to implement these operations is really important, both at a political level and at a regulatory level. The details differ in the 3 countries we're operating in. We're currently operating in Australia, in Finland, and in the United States. And the approaches vary, and that means that there are different things that we can do and different ways that we operate in the 3 countries. But at its sort of at a very basic level, is a country and is a region excited to see a drone operation take place? And then you sort of get into the next level of question, which is, okay, now that we've said we want to do this and we see the benefits of providing a service like drone delivery or infrastructure inspection via drone or agriculture use cases, then it's, how do we allow this? Because most countries in the world up until recently, and recently could be anywhere between, the last year or 2 or the last 5 or 6, depending on what countries we're talking about, didn't have a framework for drones because people weren't operating them. And so what we've seen works well, and where we've had success with our approvals and with being able to advance and get closer to scale with our operations, is countries that have adopted risk and performance-based approaches to assessing the safety of these operations and to granting approvals. And so what do I mean by that? One of the things, and Lorenzo is an expert here, and so welcome his thoughts on this, but one of the tools that we have used is the SORA process. So the JARIS working groups have gotten together and defined a risk-based approach and a performance-based approach to assessing our operations, the areas we want to operate, the reliability of our aircraft, and sort of how all those pieces fit together to reach what you could call a target level of safety or an acceptable level of risk. And then we have to demonstrate that, right? We have to show the regulator that this is the level of safety that you want to achieve. And this is how we show that and here's the data that proves that our operations are reliable, safe, that we have the appropriate mitigations in place to do the kinds of operations that we want to do. And for us, that means operations beyond line of sight, operations over people, and operations for commercial purposes. And so that is a framework that has worked very well for us. We're using that framework in Australia. We're using that framework in Europe, and that in our operations in Finland. And that has been something that has not only allowed us to start slowly, right? When we first started our operations in Australia, we were operating in fairly rural areas, not over a lot of people, and an airspace that was not particularly used by traditional aviation. And we are now operating in suburban Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, and in suburban Logan, serving thousands of customers and completing over 100,000 deliveries just in the last year. And so we've seen that growth. The US has taken a slightly different approach to saying we'd like to have drone operations here. They have an extensive set of rules for aviation that has been sort of built over the last several decades. And they have said, okay, we're going to allow you to do this, but we want to see how you meet all of the pieces of the rules that apply to traditional aviation. And if you can't meet them because you don't have a pilot in the aircraft, or because certain aspects of your operation are done by automation, then you need to ask for a waiver to the rule or an exemption to the rule. And we'll consider whether you meet an acceptable level of whether you meet the intent of that rule. And what we see there is that there are certain aspects of that make a lot of sense, right? We want to meet the intent of those rules. They were created to enhance safety in the airspace. The thing that has been challenging is that it really was a set of rules that was created for an entirely different technology. And so trying to fit ourselves into that framework has been difficult. And it has sometimes taken longer than the approach that we're seeing in other countries. That said, I think given the framework that exists in the US, one could argue that by allowing these operations to occur via waiver and exemption, it is moving much faster, and the FAA is learning a lot about what the future rules should look like, so that when they write the rule for operations beyond line of sight, they will have a lot more experience, and the rule will be accommodating of the different use cases they're seeing, the different methods that they're seeing, and will hopefully pull in some of the lessons that we've all learned from this experience. So, from my perspective, what do regulators around the world need to be doing? That was sort of the last part of your question. It really gets to this. Ideally, they'd be looking for outcomes-based, performance-based rules. This is the outcome that we want to see. There might be different ways of getting there, right? The way our operation works versus the way Harrison's operations work might be slightly different, but if we're meeting the same level of safety, that should be okay.
So from your perspective, and something that certainly is in the mind of every regulator and government bodies equally, is driving investment. So from your perspective, does this focus on performance-based and outcomes-based, regimes, does that help foster investment and innovation? And if not, then help us understand.
I think it does. And it certainly can, particularly if there is some certainty also around what that process looked like. And so we are still in an early stage of this industry. And I think if you look at the way we operate today versus the way we operated 2 years ago, we've learned a lot from operating, right? And from the 100,000+ flights that we've done and the thousands of customers we have. And so having the ability to be flexible and change our operations, to upgrade our systems, to make modifications to the aircraft, to better suit the needs of our customers and the communities that we're operating with is important. And so having a regulatory regime that is performance-based and sort of outcomes focused, again, allows some of those changes to happen in a timeline that is probably better suited to this industry than the traditional processes that we've seen for crewed aviation. And I think if you can pair that with some certainty as to what that process looked like and what the expectations are, i.e., you must meet this level of safety. You must demonstrate this, not just in tests, but also in operations. Having that paired together, I think is incredibly helpful to the industry, because it then tells us this is what we need to do. And if we achieve this and we are able to demonstrate this, then we can operate, and it is worth investing additional resources to grow and to expand.
Could I just add one thing to that? Because it's so right on. I think one of the things that we're all talking about is trust, right? Societal trust. And whether that's target level of safety or performance-based or a risk-based approach or this mechanism of like going through waivers and building out, I have heard a lot of critique from where the FAA has been or where other civil aviation authorities have gone. And ultimately, it seems to me that everybody's working in the act of trying to build trust with their own constituents and the people that they're asked to protect. And so for me, I've seen just the amazing work that Wing has done, that Zipline has done to try to engage local communities and to build out from this crawl, walk, run approach. Even if drones were allowed tomorrow all over the world, all throughout the skies, you wouldn't be able to just go at scale over any community. Because you have to build that trust out, whether it's our operations in Arkansas, where it's working with engaging with community through schools, or building out curriculum, or bringing on, whether it's political leaders or local leaders to come see the operations firsthand, to experience what a delivery looks like. That doesn't just go from, 2 flights a day to 10,000 flights a day in one step, right? So I think it is really important for operators and government authorities to work together to build out this trust for community. And it's something that I think at Zipline we hold even above, trying to get approvals first, right? It is about engaging with the community, making sure this is something they want, they feel comfortable with. And Wing has done some amazing leadership in this way, had published some really interesting reports, and it's something that I think is even more fundamental than, can you meet a target level of safety? It really gets back to that risk or that trust equation of, well, do we deserve to have the public's trust in this? And therefore, will the approvals come?
Yeah, and if I may add, Catherine, on top of what Harrison just said, I think word trust resonates a lot, and also what Margaret was talking about before, the risk-based approach. I mean, we can talk about this probably later, but what I wanted to say is that there is an element that I don't know if we touch it sufficiently. That is, what is the incentive structure, or those who are regulating to allow operations, right? And I give you a simple example. I mean, in starting from Switzerland, then we can talk about Europe. Like in Switzerland, the Federal Office of Civil Aviation, where I used to work for, has 2 separate mandates, and these 2 different separate mandates are handled by 2 independent divisions. There is a mandate to foster and push Swiss aviation in Europe and globally, and there is the mandate to make sure that that's safe. And as you can imagine, the people that populate these 2 different divisions and their take on drones is very, very different, right? If all you need to take care of is the safety of people on the ground, well, the safest state is that no one flies. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? So my incentive could be to say no to everybody, because ultimately I have no reason why I need to take the risk myself. And I was the regulator, I was the one signing, and I know what it feels, right, to sign the early drone approvals flying over a city. It doesn't feel good at all. So, and even if you have, reviewed all the things and whatever, you still like signing and like, wow, if something goes wrong here, this is not going to end up well. Right. But on the other side, I had my, aviation promotion and pushing colleagues that were saying that's the right thing to do. We need to engage. We need to make sure that this happens, right? If you bring it up one notch, in Europe, for example, the EASA is a European Aviation Safety Agency. So yes, they try to help, yes, they try to promote, but their primary responsibility is to ensure safety. And that's why you can see from their side as well, there is not so much incentive to take, or as Sheridan would put it, this appetite for risk is relatively low. However, the European Commission on the other side, they are there to create a single European market for drones. They are there to create jobs, right? And they push EASA. So what I have seen, and what we did, for example, with in the past years within JARUS and creating the JARUS SORA as this framework, I always said this, and I piss off a lot of regulators, but I say it all the time, is like we give to the industry a tool to go to those regulators that do not want to approve you and say, but look, it's safe, right? And if those who are, let's say, not inclined to approve because they have no incentive structure tell you no, well, then you can speak with the other guys and say, look, you know, your safety people are telling me no, but actually I have a method here which is internationally recognized that seems to say that I'm doing a safe thing. So can we work together on this topic? And what I have seen, that both as a regulator now as a consultant, is that the countries that go ahead are the ones that say yes to this. The country that says, yes, let's have a look at this risk assessment and let's see actually, even if we don't have the law and whatever, can we have this bias for action, Harrison, you and Margaret, and say, okay, we find a way forward, right? And when that happens, then you have operations and then the companies can build trust and so on. But if that doesn't happen because this more, let's say, market or job-oriented structure do not exist or do not have sufficient power, then it's much easier for an inspector of an authority or for me in the past to say, sorry, I don't want to take this risk. And you don't comply with the requirements to have the flight manual on the aircraft, therefore you cannot fly. You know what I mean? It's an excuse, but it's a powerful one, and it's enough to prevent a lot of operations in a lot of places in the world.
Kurt or Margaret, anything else to add?
No, I would just say that I could not agree more with the points that Harrison and Lorenzo made. You know, I think this will be an ongoing journey for the entire industry as well as regulators. And I think, and frankly, the communities, to Harrison's point, right? We must interact and we must build the trust with communities, or else our business will not be a success. And so all of these things have to come together. And I think one of the most challenging parts of this industry is actually bringing all of these things together at the same time, right? So finding sort of the political support, bringing the community support, bringing the safety case and the demonstrating your safety, bringing the regulator along, getting to that first operation is really difficult, right? It is a very challenging thing to line up all of those pieces and actually start operations. And then once we do start, what we see often is that people genuinely see the value of this. And then regulators start to feel more comfortable when they see safe operations happening, and governments start to see that there are benefits to their communities to starting. But that first phase, like that first go and the first flight, all of the pieces that have to go into getting to that first flight in a new place, it's a lot of work. It's very difficult, and it requires an open dialogue between the applicant and the regulator to build that trust, and then sort of with the community to bring in the community to understand their needs and the desires and sort of the broader political landscape as well.
Well, let's use that concept of trust. And I think Harrison used the word trust equation. And Harrison, I'll jump to you to keep discussing the stakeholder engagement piece, because a lot of what you're all commenting on comes back to that. So a really broad question for you, Harrison. What would you say, and maybe it differs depending on the regions in the world, but what is the level of public acceptance that you're seeing?
Wow, that is, what is the level of public acceptance? I think it differs, right? It changes no matter where you are. When you're operating and you're, you know, it's very easy to see, take Rwanda and Ghana, for example, where we operate at national scale every day. We have 2 distribution centers in Rwanda. We're moving up to 8 in Ghana. And the reason that those are successful is because from very early on, we had people whose lives were dramatically impacted, like every day. And so ministries of health were advocates and champions, not civil aviation authorities, right? And I think that is a huge piece of this is finding your local champions who care deeply about serving their communities and being a partner, not being necessarily trying to sell something that's not wanted, right? I think it's that old business program adage of like, sell this pen to somebody, and it's not about selling the pen. It's about hearing what someone needs and making sure that you are engaging with them at their level, and providing a service that matters to them. I think it's also why the public acceptance is a little bit different in between emerging economies and some other economies, where it's less well understood that there is an urban-rural divide in healthcare and in consumer products, right? It may cost a lot to deliver a package to a rural community in West Virginia, and that just may be absorbed by a company whose entire business model is delivering. So if you can work with that middle mile delivery service to say, look, we can impact your bottom line, and then you can access more people, and you can create a more resilient, reliable network of service. Well, that matters to them in a very different way than matters to folks whose lives are being really positively impacted. And I think, again, I would just reiterate that it's really important to understand, to listen to the communities you're working with to build out the acceptance. It's not about coming in and saying, look, we have something that you want. Every time we engage a new community, it's different. But we do have some processes in place to help build out that acceptance, right? Finding local champions at the level of who's going to be working with us. And I think, we're beginning to see in very advanced, markets where throughput and reliability is very high already in transportation, that there is demand. I think the pandemic, for example, that is still going on, was a moment in time where the catalyst changed from, well, do we need drone delivery? Do we need contactless delivery? Will this actually be useful to society? To, okay, how do we get it? How do we ensure that it's safe? Yes, we believe in contactless delivery. How do we make sure that it happens at low cost and is safe, right? And that just mindset change is very important. And I think it's something that we've seen in the United States lead to an expansion in approvals. We've seen new cities come online. We've seen new local champions. We've seen political leaders who say, my community wants to join the rest of the world in understanding a low cost logistics network that's safe and secure and reliable. And with inclement weather events, we're starting to see that matters quite a bit. Being able to have a reliable supply chain, even when roads are inaccessible, like that, to me, we're only beginning to see the demand of climate-related delivery needs. So I'm not sure if I answered your question exactly, but I think many to summarize, jurisdictions are different, and it's all about the populations you're working with and providing a service that they want, not that you want to give them.
Yeah.
Right. And Kurt, I'll turn to you then. Similar question, but I guess from a slightly different angle, just from a regulator's angle or from a government angle. What strategies do you see as being important to help industry get this public acceptance and the public buy-in and that trust?
One difference, I think, in Asia, I'm generalizing here, so take it with a grain of salt, but in Asian societies, in a lot of cases, the public is more willing to go along with what the government directs or what the government suggests, with less resistance, and they'll give the government the benefit of the doubt. So I think in one respect, it's a little bit easier being in a country like Korea or China, where the government will make some decisions and the public will go along with it generally. You saw that during, in the pandemic, in terms of mask wearing and social distancing and things like that. So I think the government doesn't have as difficult a task in getting the public on board as it might in other countries, but still, people do need to be, follow and be willing to go along with new technologies. I think in the major countries in Asia, the governments have determined that this technology, drone use, is going to be a huge economic boon to the countries, and they're going into it with a lot of enthusiasm, and they're trying to develop that enthusiasm among the public. So in Korea, where I practice, there has been a lot of effort to publicize advancements in the technology and to talk about the benefits that have come from that. So we see a lot of media coverage of activities that are taking place. There was a delivery of medical supplies to an island. It was like a 45-minute round trip that was well publicized. There's a Korean company that has come up with a hydrogen cell battery technology that now provides about 10 times as much power as one could have, or length of time, as lithium batteries. That was well publicized. There's a Korean company that has a wonderful swarm platform, and they have used their technology to create light shows in the evening with swarms of drones that will create different images. We saw that during the Winter Olympics in the opening and closing sessions. At night, there were wonderful displays in the sky created with drones. And actually right now in Korea, over the Han River, that swarm technology has been used by the government to provide images of masks, images of people washing their hands, images, messages about encouraging social distancing. So people see these all the time. By the way, you can see that on YouTube, I think, if you want to see some examples of that. But so there has been this big effort to try to keep it in the minds of the public and to try to demonstrate that there will be advantages and that this is some technology that is going to be great for Korea. It's part of, they call it Hallyu, bringing the Korean wave around the world. And that's taking place in other countries as well. There's been a lot of publicity about the benefits of the use of drones and how they can be, how they will help society, help the economy, and help people at large.
Catherine, can I add one thing very briefly on this, because just a perspective that just came to my mind is that we're talking about public acceptance of drones, like in a relatively, let's say, generic manner. So what's the wave of acceptance for the technology in general, which I think is very important, and it's kind of getting in more and more, and the pandemic helped. But I wanted to bring the focus also on the acceptance on the individual operator, on individual companies, right? I mean, Margaret mentioned this, and Harrison mentioned this as well. It's not easy for a company to just benefit from the general trend if they don't do the right things themselves, right? And it's also very easy and it's also very possible that despite a negative trend, a company or operators that have a good, solid, record, they can get accepted where no one else can, right? So I think there is a responsibility for the individual operators to seek public acceptance in the first place, but secondly, to operate safely, right? Because whatever you gain, even if it takes you 5 or 10 years, the moment that you not have an accident, because that happens and it can happen to everybody, but the moment that you have an accident that upon investigation proves that you are negligent, that your company is not in check with a lot of, that's it. Your acceptance is immediately gone, right? And I think this is a very important aspect that I'm not so sure that all operators take seriously, like be responsible and not just surf the wave, but you need to be responsible yourself and make sure that your acceptance is gained and maintained by proper operation and safe operation, right? So it's I also think that that's also where using the right safety tools, using the right safety methods, being in a framework that you trust, being able to lead to safe operations is something that these operators have to seek for, almost irrespective from the regulation that applies to them. Yeah? I can tell to an operator, just go and fly. You are free to go do whatever you want, but I would never do that, right? As an operator, I would always go back and say, but how do I make sure it's safe? How do I make sure that my operation is safe and I can therefore maintain my public acceptance? So there is an element of responsibility that we don't have to underestimate just because there is a general acceptance of the technology, right?
Margaret.
Catherine, maybe I could just jump in here. I mean, I think what Lorenzo said is really spot on. I think we really we believe fundamentally that without community's acceptance and trust, we will not have a business. And so we must engage, not just sort of on the surface level, but really listen to what communities are thinking about, the questions that they have, the concerns, engage with them in a dialogue, be responsive. Doesn't mean necessarily that every concern we're able to address exactly the way they would like, but really engaging with them on what their questions are, what their concerns are, and how we can address the ones that we're able to. And I think what we've seen in that, right, we do when we go in to operate in a new area, right, we actually published on our website a list of best practices from the community engagement that we've done in the places where we've started operations. And, you know, from our perspective, really sitting down and listening to the community about what kind of a service they want, what will be valuable to them, what would be a concern to them, helps us as we engage with them, and then how we respond to them. And I think, you know, one of the things that we've experienced is that if you are serious about that engagement and you are committed to doing it, we've had a very positive response to our service around the world. And we as part of the FAA's integration pilot program, we worked with Virginia Tech, who was, and the state of Virginia, and Virginia Tech conducted a survey a year after we started service of the community where we were operating. And just to give, like, it is different everywhere, but just to give you some numbers, right, of a place that's actually lived with drone delivery service happening in their community every day for over a year, you know, the response there was that 87% of the residents in the area of operation like drone delivery, and 89% either have used the service or want to use it when it becomes available to them. And so I think what you start to see is that sometimes you see a hesitation to this technology. And a lot of that is based on things that people perceive to be about the technology rather than what the technology actually is. And the only way to change that perception is to actually start talking to people about what the technology actually does and what the service actually looks like, and to take that responsibility seriously of designing a service, to Harrison's point, that is valuable to the community, right? Zipline has created an incredibly valuable service in the countries where it's operating. And so in doing that, they've been able to bring a country along to say, this is something that's worth investing in, that's worth allowing. And I think that is really critically important to our success. I think the last thing is just building on what Lorenzo said. The first question that we always get from people when we engage with them is this safe? And how safe is it, right? And so to your point, Lorenzo, it has to be safe, right? And it's not just what the regulator tells us it has to be. We want it to be safe, because if it's not safe, then we can't go into those conversations and say, yes, we've done tens of thousands of test flights that's gone through all of these processes. We've done hundreds of thousands of flights on this system. We know that it's safe. These are the processes that we use. And so that is of critical importance. And it is a responsibility that we take very seriously. And I think the rest of the industry, as they're looking to grow and to scale, has to take seriously and has to continue to be willing to engage, not just with the regulators on, but with the broader community.
Thank you, everyone, for your thoughts on that. Let's switch gears, but Margaret, I'll stay with you, and it's on the topic of how drones are actually fitting within, or if they are fitting within, airspace. So it's this concept of segregation or integration. So I think the answer is likely obvious to most who are signed in today, but from your perspective, what's preferable, segregation or integration, and what type of evolution do you see on the horizon?
Yeah, thanks. So I think the only answer is integration. It's just, how do we get there, right? So for operations to scale and for all users of the airspace to have access, we have to have integration. And so I look at, I think we've seen a lot of progress on this, and in particular, I would look at the recent use-based regulation that comes into effect in 2023. This is about creating opportunity for integration and for all users of the airspace to share that airspace and to have access to it. And so, some of the things that we look at as opportunities there for that integration is establishing core data exchange services, right? So how do users of the airspace, drone to drone and drone to traditional aviation, how do we share, how do we exchange data? How do we share information about where we are in the airspace? And one of the things that I see as particularly sort of forward leaning in this regulation is that they are allowing for multiple service providers to be providing this service. And that is important because it allows different kinds of services for different kinds of operations, so long as they meet sort of regulatory requirements and safety expectations. The other thing that I think is really positive in the European regulation is the approach to conspicuity, creating conspicuity, but also allowing different approaches to that conspicuity. So you might be able to operate in UTM, you might be able to have a transponder on your aircraft. There are multiple, right? It's not a specific technology that is mandated, but it is saying that you have to be conspicuous, and if you're going to fly in use space, and here are some ways to do it. That allows people to innovate around cost. It allows standards to be created to allow that transfer of data. I mean, I think there's a lot in this sort of approach that will maybe not all at once move us to integrated airspace, but allows us to take that journey to integrated airspace as the technology comes into development, as the standards are created. And ultimately gets us where we want to be in as an industry. We see some different approaches in different countries around the world, and certainly as we are learning and as the industry is growing, there is room for segregated airspace. It can allow you to show that your operation can be done safely in emergency circumstances. It can allow expedited approvals to access airspace. So there's certainly a use, particularly today, for segregated airspace, but the end goal has to be getting to an integrated airspace.
So how concerned, Margaret, is Wing, or others, please jump in, with privacy concerns that arise when we've got that integrated airspace and there's communications and everyone is conspicuous?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we certainly want to ensure that when you create conspicuity, that you are also being mindful of privacy, both of the operator and of the people that those operations are serving. The good news is that there are ways to do that with technology, and I would point back to the ASTM standard that the industry and regulators spent a number of years implementing or putting together, that does just that. It creates a technology agnostic path towards creating conspicuity for UAS, but also protects users' privacy, and customers' privacy. And so I think that you can have both, right? I think there are means to enable both, and it's just sort of moving into that. Moving into and adopting those standards that have been created by industry and the regulators.
Anyone else?
I can confirm that. I mean, what Margaret just said, in the sense in my past life with the Swiss authority, I mean, I was leading the so-called Swiss use space implementation. Right? There was this idea of creating some a public partnership, public-private partnership to advance the topics of UTM and use space, even beyond what is the regulation that at the time didn't even exist, right? And one of the challenges we faced, the first one was like direct remote ID versus network remote ID, and how do we do that, and privacy and so on. And there has been a lot of work on this topic, and ultimately in Switzerland nowadays, there is a developed and fully operational network remote identification that is based exactly on the standard that Margaret was mentioning. That works and that protects the privacy by technical means that are very effective, right? So I think this question is now proven, like it's what you said, Margaret. The technology exists, we can implement it, and thanks to the fact that we can build on top of it for other services, we can really benefit from the construct that is in itself allowing privacy to exist and not to be exploited forever. Also for other services, so not only for remote identification, but you can think about flight authorization services, traffic information. The whole construct, I think, is there. It works. So I can testify to that as a regulator that actually implemented it, and it works. So absolutely.
And Kurt, in your view, as we talk about this move toward integration, how accepting or supportive, maybe supportive is going a bit too far, but how accepting is traditional aviation of this integration model that we foresee happening?
At least in Asia, we have seen a lot of acceptance. In Korea, they formed a team, a UTM or UAM team that is a public-private team of companies and government that are working together, and they've come up with a plan to develop UTM and UAM systems over time. That includes Korean Air and some of the other airlines as well. And the basic format has been that from 2020 to 2024, I believe, they call that the preparation stage. So they're doing they're identifying issues, they're doing testing for safety reasons and other reasons, and they're going to establish UTM-related regulations that are supposed to be released next year. Then from 2025 to 2029, they're going to move into commercializing at least some routes, linking some of the transport hubs. One thing about Korea, Seoul, I've been told, has the most heliports of any city in the world, and they're expecting that they'll be able to utilize, I think it's like 94 vertiports for UAM. So that will be part of the process. Hyundai is part of that. Hyundai believes they will be commercializing around 2028. The government thinks 2025. And then from 2030 to 2035, there'll be a growth stage where they're going to expand the routes. They're going to get more businesses, and they're going to start trying to have businesses actually make a profit off this. So they're working together. I know that there were recent UTM tests that were done at Incheon Airport. There's a plan to develop a drone taxi system between Seoul and Incheon Airport. Korean Air has been part of that. Korean Air has been using drones in themselves in their operations, and they've also signed an R&D cooperative agreement with Incheon Airport and one of the Korean regulatory research and development institutes to develop the UAM industry. I know Japan has had UTM trials in November of last year. All Nippon Airways was part of that process as well, so they're in support. I know Singapore has had similar sorts of testing as well. So the process is moving forward, and I think the legacy aircraft operators are behind it, are in favor, and are very cooperative at this time.
Well, it's interesting, the remarks that you make about Korean Air and others. My own personal view is that the airlines just simply have to be behind this and have to be part of it as users of airspace. I'm not sure if anyone else has views on that, or if we should move on to our final question today.
But I think it's important to make sure that it's done properly, so that there will be no interference with the legacy aviation entities in their operations. And I think everybody's mindful of that, the need to do that. It's a safety issue, and it's also makes sense, from business and every other perspective.
I would just love to respond, I think, to some of the earlier conversation around integration and segregation and sort of getting to this idea of communication and conspicuity, which is really, really important. And just one thing that strikes me is that we're just beginning, right? This like 20-year journey, right? And I think the layers are being put in place today that will have dramatic impact on this 20-year journey, right? So the beginning of a journey, if you change direction by 10 degrees and then walk for 10 years, like that's a huge difference from where you'll be. And so it's really, really important for all of us to work together on these issues and to drive towards something that's harmonizable, that will have meaning in 20 years. So I think that the work in ASTM is really important. The use-based leadership is fundamentally important, and want to thank those who are engaged in that. And then I just am reminded from something that I think Andy Thurling always says, which is that, in the beginning, there were thou shall nots, right? There were thou shall not require any new equipage for unmanned aircraft or uncrewed aircraft, and thou shall not redesign the airspace. And already I think some of those fundamental assumptions and requirements from things like SC 228, some of those earlier working groups, 203, are now being challenged in various areas. And already, this is only 5 years of this 20-year journey, like these fundamental concepts are being reconsidered around the world with leadership by those here and elsewhere. And so just understanding that change is happening now is really important. And, Zipline is excited to be a part of that, working towards conspicuity and segregation and integration and making sure we move towards that world. So just pointing those two things out, because I think it's really important in this conversation to recognize that.
So let's move to that concept of harmony. And this is our last prepared topic, and we've already gotten many questions, and hopefully we have time to cover at least a few of them. So on the topic of harmony, of regulations, of the consistency of standards, Lorenzo, I'm quite confident that you support the harmony and consistency. So talk to us about how you see the best ways to promote that, whether it's on a regional level or on a global level.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, and I cannot help but smiling at the thou shall nots, and from Andy Thurling, right? Because how do you harmonize? You harmonize by kind of like smoothing out the peaks and valleys of the thou shall nots people, right? Is this idea that you need to bring them all around the table and somehow let them fight them out. And again, Andy Thurling is a veteran of the JAROS working group SRM, where a lot of this work has been going on in the past probably 7 or 8 years, right? And there have been a lot of these kind of conversations, very heated conversations, and sometimes even too much, right? And but that's the only way. Like for me, the only way is to confront and to really getting it out. It's like you say, thou shalt not, but why, right? What is that is driving you to say that? And do you actually have a concern? What is your concern? How can we take it into account? And it's a really like painstaking exercise of smoothing out all of these peaks and valleys, all these extremes, and slowly converging into something new that in general people are not used to apply, and that therefore are genuinely afraid to do so. Right? There is fear around the new regulatory framework. How is it going to happen? So from my perspective, the JAROS, the Joint Authority for Rulemaking of Unmanned System, has been really instrumental globally to this harmonization effort, simply because we brought people together, right? And you could confront with colleagues from all around the world with their experiences and their thou shall not, right? And say, well, look, in my jurisdiction, I don't have that. I have this other problem, right? And then really talking and having this, I would say, push to deliver, because sometimes otherwise you're always talking, you never harmonize nothing. So you need to have really like a drive. You talk and then you drive people to write down and say, okay, what is that we have achieved now? Have we made a step forward? If not, why not, right? And I think you can do that absolutely at global level. I can see this happen with Jarus and the Jarus Sora, which is now used indeed globally and somewhere more than somewhere else. But that's the way it is. And there is also what I wanted to say, this very fascinating, this interest for harmonization. I remember when I was in Jarus even before the Jarus Sora started, at the low end of my team, we were 2 people in the team, like myself and a colleague from the FAA. And they were like holding the flag and just as 2 guys and then you start to have more and people start to say, hey, we need to do something. From 2 you become 5 and then you start to do the first products and it makes sense and people are interested and they pool around those groups and those organizations that have a higher chance of success, because of course it's expensive to go to a Jarus meeting, it's expensive to go to an ASTM meeting, and people don't want to waste their time, right? So it's not only about bringing people around the table, having a nice chat, it's about, do we have a chance to make an impact here? Are we doing the right thing? And if the answer is yes, you will see this like magnet effect, like the industry will come on, the regulator will come on. And now you look at Jarus Working Group 6, now SRM, okay, or 6, is 100 of people and more in different task forces, all trying to achieve this harmonization of this SORA tool, which is then allowing everybody to harmonize at least partially at global level. And I've seen the same thing happening with the ASTM around the UTM standards that Margaret was mentioning, around EuroCAE 105, where Alexandra Florent also from Wing is leading and is trying to achieve the same thing. So absolutely, I think we need to do it at global level, at regional level, but with a lot of harmonization, ASTM, EuroCAE, or RTCA, EuroCAE, not duplicate the effort and so on, and do it at a technical level as well, so that we can convince the thou shalt nots that what we are doing, although different, is safe, it's okay to do, and everybody can somehow feel comfortable in doing whatever is coming. So that's my recipe, and we achieved a fair success, I have to say. So I think we need to keep going this way.
And Harrison, in developing countries, in particular, and zip lines operating in developing countries, what do you see as the best ways to promote that consistency and harmonization?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, one of the ways that we've seen emerging economies work together in order to harmonize is through what are called regional safety organizations. So in Africa, there are a number of RSOs, CASOA, you have, support from ICAO, Eastern and Southern Africa, and you start to see, and as well as like the African Union, where you have a number of experts all working in the interest of unifying skies and making sure that aviation is safe, secure, reliable, and more recently, sustainable, right? So there's a huge push in sustainability, which is really great for the drone industry. I know we have some internal data that demonstrates just how impactful drones can be for sustainability when you compare to even an electric vehicle on the ground for delivery. But back to your question. So working with RSOs and working with ICAO directly has a huge impact. When we're looking at, if you just take the example of Eastern Africa, where you have members like Rwanda and Tanzania, and you start to say, look, we want to operate in 2 or 3 of these countries. It's in our interests to bring together these political entities to have these conversations. And very, very quickly, you see leaders and champions among these RSOs wanting to drive harmonization and standardization. It makes their job easier. It makes their job more rewarding to say, look, we have UAS operations in multiple countries here that are providing immense value to our people or the people that we work with. And from there, so really it is sort of a bottom-up approach, working with the champions within a country that you've already proven your value to and you've built trust with, and then having them be advocates for the industry to say, look, this can make an immense beneficial impact in your world and with your aviation structures. I would also say that the existing ecosystem is really important, right? So if you're working, so in many emerging economies, you see organizations like IFATCA, you see, the air traffic organizations really having an outsized role that you don't see in more advanced economies, providing services, providing consulting services and support that are already trusted and have been trusted for decades. And so bringing them along and making sure that, look, we're not here to disrupt or displace you, we're here to work with you, is really fundamentally important. And so for us, I think that's where we've found success and where we've found a lot of fulfillment in not just growing our own business, but sort of bringing along all sorts of ecosystem players to grow with us. And I think, to me, that's one of the reasons that I joined Zipline a year ago today. And it's why I think, it's fulfilling. So thanks for the question.
Absolutely. Well, subject to any other comments that you may have, I think we'll turn to some of the questions because we have a few minutes remaining and we've gotten many good ones. So I'll read this question out, and it really relates to risks to the drone industry, but I'm going to add a bit to it and ask you to comment on opportunities as well. So of all the factors mentioned during this discussion, regulatory approaches, political leadership, community concerns, perceptions of risk, and the local versus national regulatory regimes, which one of these is the greatest concern and presents the biggest risk to the future of drones? And I'm layering on and the greatest opportunity too. Who would like to take it away? I know that's a big one.
I'll take a stab at starting and just be brief on it. I think that the community acceptance of the technology is the one that we will be working on, not just today, but for many, many, many years into the future. If you think about how long the transition from sort of horse and buggy to cars took, right? Bringing something totally new around, or from people who had never been in an airplane to getting on an airplane took. We know that takes time, that adjustment takes time. And so I think that is one where we, as the people developing the technology, have our own fate in our own hands, right? So this is a place where we're controlling the outcome here, and we have the ability to build the technology in a way that the community will accept and will find value in. The other things are certainly significant hurdles to being successful and may prove insurmountable. But without the first one, I think you won't end up with a viable business.
If I might add one thing, I saw the question coming from Doug Johnson, and Doug, he's a great champion of technology, and we all love Doug. And one of the things I wanted to say, I love the question because I try to bring the perspective down, not only to the whole industry, but to the individual pieces of the industry. I think one of the major risks is the underestimation of how difficult it is to get where you want to get, right? I mean, again, I work with a lot of companies, some have full understanding of that, others a little bit less, others that I don't work with because they have no understanding. And it's really, really challenging. And the problem is that we are all going, there is the hype, we want to go fast, we need investment, we need to run, we need to go fast. But at the end of the day, all of this is aviation. At the end of the day, we are going into an aviation system. And those like, Zipline, Margaret, who have decided, to take this seriously and to go through the process. Margaret, you were mentioning this before, compliance with all the manned aviation regulation and signing of all the exceptions of all the rules, that is a massive endeavor, right? And we are still not at scale. We are still not talking about operating over millions of cities. When you try to scale operations, and it means you have no more 10 aircraft in the air. You're gonna have 1,000 and 10,000, 1,000,000. And these planes will fail, and you need to handle those failures. You need to investigate those failures, because this is a responsibility that is put upon you by the aviation regulator. You can investigate one failure, okay, 10 failure, okay. What about 10,000 failures a day. Can you investigate those, right? So the challenge is really like not underestimating, otherwise we will all be here with these point approvals, like I can fly here, I can fly there, but the moment we try to scale, suddenly kind of the beast is gonna bite us and push us back 5 years because, you know, it's just not what we were prepared to do. And I can never stress this enough, you know, it's really difficult and we need to take it seriously.
I guess.
Go ahead, Harrison.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. My biggest concern is poor data practices in the industry. I think that we haven't really established like a ground level for data. There's a number of industries that we're drawing from, and there are a variety of levels to this, right? Because we are in the healthcare industry, we, you know, have tangential, you know, access to health data, right? And so, you know, where we go, who we're delivering to, like we need to protect that. And from there to aviation data practices and our responsibility as both a service provider and a manufacturer, that requires a lot of different, you know, data responsibilities and reporting requirements and protecting, you know, protections. And then also things related in Europe, you know, to GDPR that as an American company, like we're not as familiar with, but we're certainly developing that expertise and in-house knowledge. I think, you know, if you start to see sloppy data practices in the industry, then it'll lose a ton of trust, and we just won't be taken seriously beyond just a drone company. We want to be seen as like, you know, an organization that really cares about the people we serve and the communities we work with. So for me, it's sloppy data practices in the industry, and most specifically within my own company, but not for any particular reason. Just for me, that's what keeps me up at night.
Well, that goes back to the trust point you made earlier too, Harrison, and you've all spoken about. Kurt, final word. This is our last minute from this lively discussion.
Okay, just on that point, I think from an Asia perspective, you know, the Asian countries, they're participating in JARAS. They're eager to learn and to share information. So I'm not concerned about the regulatory environment. I think that they will be very similar to what a lot of other countries around the world are doing. But to follow up on what Margaret said, I think that even in a country that's very compliant with government requirements and government requests, if you lose the public, if there are safety concerns, if there are issues, the public is not going to use the products. The government is good. I think in all these countries are good at reading the political tea leaves. And if they see that they're losing the public, you'll see that the regulations will change, and it will be, you know, it could be a real problem for the industry. So safety and making sure that everything works properly, those are very important for the industry to continue to develop.
Everyone, I can't thank you enough for participating today and providing the varied viewpoints, but also I think there's a lot of consistency to what you're all saying about what is happening, which is hopeful, and what we need to keep driving towards. So we didn't get to all the questions, but thank you so much to all those who submitted them. And thank you for joining us today. Thanks, everyone.